and it's very challenging to try to get a clear idea of what this intersection is between mental illness and satanic possession. And you may not be convinced that satanic possession is a real thing. Very interestingly, a few years ago, I read a book and I reread it in preparing for the sermon today, and I've read a lot of different materials, by a guy called F. Scott Peck. I don't know if you know F. Scott Peck. He wrote a book, a very famous book called The Road Less Travelled. And he's actually a psychiatrist, a psychologist, but he's also a Christian. In the process in which he was going through in writing that book, an important part of the process of him accepting Christ in his life. And he is a practicing psychiatrist and psychologist, and he always was worried and challenged about this whole idea. He knew mental illness, he knew about it, he had a working knowledge with it, but he wondered whether there was such a thing as demonic possession and whether it was real. So he decided as a skeptic, even though he's a Christian, to see if there was he would actually have any experiences. And he put his name out there and he said, I'm willing to be a part of an exorcism and come along and observe. And he tells in his book, The People of the Lie, that he had two experiences where he was involved in an exorcism. And he says, and details in that book, the things that were quite different, very different in his experience dealing with two people who were demon-possessed compared to dealing with people in his everyday work with mental illness. He said that really they are very different things indeed, and that his working experience with it was that mental illness really has got nothing to do with demon possession. They've got nothing in common at all. That's his experience. I'm not going to ask you to accept his experience, but it was interesting. It's an interesting read if you want to know the perspective of a working psychiatrist and psychologist who has a very good reputation in those fields. When we look at this topic, many people often say that when we look in the stories of the Bible of Jesus casting out demons, they say that, well, he wasn't really casting out evil spirits. That really when he was dealing with people that they call demons and evil spirits, he was just really dealing with mental illness. And because the people in the day understood it as demons, that he just addressed it in that way and he didn't bother correcting them. And so he was actually healing people with mental illness, but they weren't demon-possessed in reality. And probably one of the stories in the Bible that people use the most to try to establish that is the story after the experience on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus is up on the mount and he's transfigured and his appearance is like the sun. And there's Peter, James and John there with him and they bow down to worship him, and he's there with Elijah and Moses. After they come down, the other disciples come up to him and say, help us, because this father has brought his son along who's got a demon and we can't cast this one out. You gave us power to cast out demons and we've had the power to cast out demons. This one we're not successful with. We can't manage to do it. And the description of this boy seems to fit what we would term today as epilepsy. And I ask you to turn to Mark chapter 9, and we've got the story there in Mark chapter 9. We're not going to spend a lot of time reading through all the details of it. You can read through the entire story yourself later if you like. The account is from Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29. But here, he comes down the mountain, and they're having this discussion, the disciples. And verse 17 says, one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you my son possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. Notice those things. He's possessed with a spirit which makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it slams into the ground, he foams at the mouth, he grinds his teeth and stiffens out. Now, for a lot of people who work in the medical profession, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people look at this and go, sounds like typical epilepsy. Yeah? Sounds like typical epilepsy. And so we look at this case and we go, well, from a skeptical point of view, we You go, it's not really a demon that's making this happen, it's just that it's epilepsy. But they don't understand that back then, so Jesus heals the boy of epilepsy and it's not really a demon. But I'll keep reading a little bit further. And he says to Jesus, I told your disciples to cast it out, they could not do it. He answered and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring him to me. They brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, he immediately, the spirit threw him into a convulsion. And falling to the ground, he began rolling and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? Notice this is an important piece of information as well. How long has this been going on? And he says to him, from childhood. And it has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, why, of course I can, said all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, you deaf and mute spirit, I command you to come out of him and do not enter him again. And he is free. The disciples are worried and they say, why couldn't we cast him out? And he says in verse 29, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. I suppose when we read this account, we look at it and we go, it seems to match epilepsy. And could this be just a case of epilepsy, really? And that's what we want to ask ourselves today. But Jesus is just calling it a demon because that's how people then understand it. Well, in verse 25, it's interesting you note that when Jesus speaks to the boy, he doesn't say, I heal you of your sickness. He actually talks to the spirit and he addresses the spirit and says, you mute and deaf spirit. Was Jesus in the habit of sometimes correcting people's misunderstandings about things? Yeah. So if you think this was a serious case of them misunderstanding the reality of what was going on, what do you think would be likely? Jesus would lie and go, oh, you just understand it to be a demon. I will address it as a demon because that's how you understand it, and I'm not going to address the issue. Do you think he'd effectively lie and say that and just go, it's too hard to explain? Or do you think he'd maybe try to address it? My understanding when we see Jesus and the way he works, I think he would be more than likely to try to address a misunderstanding. An example of him addressing a misunderstanding is when the disciples talk about the man who was born blind and sitting at the temple. The man who was born blind sitting at the temple, and the disciples ask him, for whose sin is he blind? Remember? Is it for his sin or his parents' sin because he was born blind? And what does Jesus say? Does he go, oh, you understand it to be someone's sin? All right, I'll kind of say it's kind of his father's sin. Does he just sort of go along with their idea? He corrects them, doesn't he? He says it's not because of anyone's sin. But he says, in fact, it's for the glory of God. He corrects their misunderstanding. Here, he very clearly addresses the issue of this boy as being a deaf and mute spirit. That would be a bit of an issue if it wasn't actually a spirit, because it wouldn't fit with how Jesus normally would work in these sort of cases. I suppose the other thing is that there's a few differences between this and some other cases of demon possession we see in the Gospels. There's a few differences we see. And we often think that they're differences, but here's a few. The boy has had this problem since he was quite young. How does a boy, when he's quite young, become possessed? Well, we don't know. We don't have any of the backstory. Can people become possessed at quite a young age? Well, all I can say is from my experience, I have known some cases. I had a friend a few years ago, and their two children that they had were at the time about 3 and 5. And they would quite often be given some money to go down to the shops and buy something from the toy store to play with. They lived really close to the shops just around the corner, and the parents sometimes would just say, here's some money, you go and buy it. And it was a safe community, it was a safe town, they didn't think anything about it. The children would go and buy toy and they'd come back and play with it. Well, that day, they gave them about $20. The children went down around the corner to the toy store. They bought a game board. They came back. Now, these are normal children, and all of a sudden, the next day and the next week, these children start acting pretty strange, like remarkably different. They start not listening to anything. They start screaming. You'd think, well, they're just having tantrums. But it was remarkably different behaviour. They started biting. The 5-year-old was just starting school, started biting other children at school, and not just biting, but biting to the point where other children were bleeding. It wasn't happening occasionally, it was happening on a daily basis. And they thought, this is really strange what's happened to our kids, dramatic difference, complete change in personality. And you know what the kids have gone down the street and bought? Well, these days, if you go into a toy store, you can buy a Ouija board as a toy, as a game board. And that's what they bought. And unbeknownst to the children, they've been playing with this Ouija board. And if you don't know what a Ouija board is, it's about communicating with spirits. It's about occultish practice. They don't, obviously, even though he was innocent, have opened themselves up to spiritual oppression at least. And there have been a real change. I've known young children to actually have issues with spiritual possession at a young age. Don't take my word for it. But here's one thing, we know that this child is young. Also, the interesting thing is the Spirit doesn't talk with Jesus, but that's because the Spirit makes the child mute. You notice that? It says the Spirit makes the child mute. Now, is that a common thing in the New Testament? A Spirit making someone mute? Well, there's at least another 2 cases in the New Testament where there's a spirit that makes a person mute that Jesus casts the demon out of. So it is actually a common thing for the Spirit to make a person mute. There are other cases in the New Testament where Jesus heals someone from a spirit, casts a demon out, that actually makes a person mute. I suppose one problem is that the description does seem to match epilepsy, but do you notice that as soon as the child comes into the presence of Jesus, what happens? What happens as soon as the child comes into the presence of Jesus? Seizure straight away. Now, epilepsy, what triggers epilepsy or epileptic fits? Who knows? We've got no idea. But it doesn't just, trigger off because you see some person, standing around. It's an immediate thing. As soon as he comes into the presence of Jesus, he has a seizure. He's on the ground, frothing. Now, every time someone with a demon comes into the presence of Jesus, what tends to happen? Does the person tend to react straight away? Or is there a delay? Every time someone with a demon comes into the presence of Jesus that we see recorded in the Gospels, straight away there's a reaction, isn't there? Straight away there's a reaction. They come to him, they might talk to him, they might call him the Son of God, all different manners of things. There's a reaction. We see with this boy, there's a reaction straight away. And I suppose number one thing is that Jesus identifies the problem as actually being possession. One thing I find really interesting about this, to say that this is just epilepsy and they didn't have an understanding of epilepsy is not reading the Bible. If you go to Matthew 4 and verse 24, it's talking about when Jesus had begun his ministry, he started healing people. I think this case is after he's healed Peter's mother-in-law. And notice what it says in Matthew 4 verse 24. It says, the news about him spread throughout all Syria. They brought to him all who were ill, those who were suffering with various diseases and pains. Notice what it says next. Demoniacs. What are demoniacs? They're people possessed, aren't they? Then it says epileptics. My Bible says epileptics. The word there means people suffering from seizures. And then it says paralytics, and he healed them. So here, did they have an understanding of these kind of diseases? Did they always identify them with demons? No. Here is a clear distinction between a demoniac and someone with epilepsy. Do you see the point? Why would they confuse this case with epilepsy if it is actually a demon? Oh, it's quite possible they could. But remember what I said to begin with. Jesus clearly identifies the problem being a demonic spirit. If Jesus identifies it as being a demonic spirit, I am likely to believe what Jesus says. You can make up your own mind about that case. But for me, it's pretty clear that this isn't a case of just a normal illness, a normal mental illness, a normal condition. This is a case of demonic possession. The people know it, and he knows it. So moving on from this case, how do we approach the issue of mental illness and possession? In the Bible, are the two the one and the same? Does the Bible make a distinction between possession and mental illness? That's an important question. Does the Bible address mental illness? In a large part, not really. But the Bible's not written to be a handbook on psychology, is it? It's not written to give us an ancient understanding and insights into mental illness. That's not why it's written. But does the Bible actually deal with mental illness as being a separate thing from possession? Well, yes, it actually does. There's quite a few cases. The two words the Bible mainly uses when dealing with what we would call mental illnesses are the two words insanity in the English and madness. Now, if we call someone who has a mental illness today either insane or mad, it's not very nice, is it? It's not the way that it's not politically correct. But that's the terminology the Bible uses. And a few cases where it talks about someone who is either mad or insane, we have the case of David when he lived amongst the Philistines. It talks about when he lived amongst the Philistines and he didn't want them to be threatened by him. So what did he do? He walked around pretending to froth at the mouth and be insane. Now that's not a case of real insanity, but it's a case of perceived insanity. Did the ancient world have an understanding that there is mental illness and there are people who are insane and not call it demon possession? Yes, they did. A few other cases, I suppose Ecclesiastes 9 verse 3 claims that when men's hearts are full of evil and insanity. Now, if demon possession equals insanity, if there's one and the same thing, why does it say evilness and insanity? Clearly, the Bible makes a distinction between the two. They're two different things. Do they have a link? Do they have an impact on each other? Maybe, but they're not the one and the same in the way the Bible talks about it. Also, you would notice that the people, the religious leaders, when Jesus was doing his ministry, what did they say about Jesus? They said to him, "You have a demon and you're insane." They didn't say you're insane because you have a demon. You notice how they put it? You have a demon and you're insane. Now they may be drawing a link between the two, but they see the two things as different. Demonic possession doesn't equal insanity. There are two different things. Also, we see when Paul is speaking and witnessing to Festus in the book of Acts. I think it's Acts 16. He's witnessing to Festus, and he claims and he proclaims to Festus that Jesus died and on the third day he rose from the grave. And Festus says, "Paul, your learning has made you insane." He sees Paul's statement as a case of insanity. Does he say, "You're possessed by a demon"? No. He says, "Your learning's made you insane." And Paul says, "No, I'm very much in my right mind." So does the Bible present that insanity is a thing of its own, or that mental health is a thing of its own? Yes, it does. If it never said anything at all, then you might have a different case to argue. But there are enough cases where it talks about it. That's just the cases where it uses the word insanity. There's many others where it talks about madness and people being... It even talks about people becoming mad because of your own circumstances. God threatened to the Israelites that if they didn't follow him, that there would be bad consequences. That they would be, for example, Jerusalem would be at siege and people inside wouldn't have any food, and he says that they would be driven insane by the circumstances they were under. That's someone having mental health issues because of circumstances, and that's very true in our lives today. People can have temporary issues with mental health, depression and other things because of circumstances. So we see the Bible talks about it and talks about it as a separate thing. The next point I want to make in looking at this topic today, which is a very important point, is how common is demon possession in the Bible? Anyone know? How common? How often does the Bible actually talk about someone being demon possessed? We see in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is it a very frequent thing? It is. There's lots of cases in Jesus' ministry where he deals with people who are demon possessed. Give me a case in the Old Testament where it refers to someone being possessed by a demon. Anyone?
King Saul.
Yeah, King Saul. Any others?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar goes mad. It talks about insanity, but it doesn't talk about possession. It doesn't say an evil spirit enters him. It just says he goes insane. Yes? Yes, that's the New Testament. Any Old Testament? That's all right, Candace. Good word. High five for getting... Yes, there you go. That's true. But in the Old Testament, King Saul is probably the most common case we can think of. It says this in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. Notice what it says. It doesn't talk about demon possession. It doesn't say a spirit of the Lord entered Saul. This is one point we need to clarify today. There is a very big difference in the Bible between demonic oppression and demonic possession. People can be oppressed by demonic spirits without being entered and possessed. I've experienced demonic oppression in my life. When I was a kid growing up, in our house at home, up until about the age 10, I can remember going to sleep nightly was a terrifying experience for me. I would routinely wake up in the middle of the night as a kid, and I would physically feel something pressing down on me and I couldn't speak. I felt scared. I felt that there was some evil kind of spirit presence around me. Don't take my word for it, I'm just telling you my experience. And I had this when I was a kid, and I can remember having these nightmares. I would routinely have the same nightmare almost every night, up until about the age 10. And I would have this nightmare. I can still remember the face of the person in the nightmare. It was a distinct person, a distinct face, and this face would come to our house and appear at a window in our house. It's the same window every time, and that face, person would break into our house and come to me, and I knew that they were trying to kill me, and I would wake up in sweats just before the person tried to kill me. The same dream happened almost every night the same way for many years. My sister and I both, years later, we're talking. My sister's not a Christian, by the way. She believes in God, but she's not a Christian. We were talking only a few years ago about our experiences when we were a kid, and we were talking about, did you ever have weird experiences when you were a kid? We never talked about it when we were kids, and I went, yeah. And we both had the same sort of experiences. We can remember going to the toilet in the middle of the night, and we'd be sitting on the toilet, and the toilet door on my parents' home has this wood grain handle. So it's a particular wood grain. The toilet door would start spinning and keep going. It didn't keep spinning like that. And there was no one standing on the other side doing it. And my sister and I both had the same experience. And it freaked us out all the time. I got to the age of 10, and all of a sudden, all this stuff stopped. I was never possessed, but there was demonic oppression in our household. And I talked with my mother a few years ago, and I said, well, we used to have this stuff happen in our home. And she goes, I know. She goes, I felt weird stuff happening too. And it stopped when I was about 10. I didn't know why. My mum said to me that when I was about 10, about the same time, in my room was a bookcase where we had all of our books. And she said that she went and found this book in our bookcase, and she got it from her father. Her father had bought it at a Rotary fair thing where they just sell books. And Mum had just ended up with the book. It had come into our house fairly early on when I was a young child. And she'd never read the book before, and she was walking past the bookcase. She thought, I'll pick it up and I'll have a look at it. She opened the front cover, and there was a picture. Some books have a picture on the front cover as you open it up. It had a particular picture of this priest, and she read the first page, and she said it was about a priest who was doing some sort of experiments. And she thought, that's really weird. She went, I don't really want to read it anymore. She put it back in the bookshelf and walked away. She didn't think much about it. And then, about a couple of weeks later, she came past again. She went, that's a really strange book. I have a funny feeling about that. She picked it up and she opened the front cover. Same book. There's no mistake. The picture changed. And the story in the front had changed. My mum straight away realised what was going on. She felt in her spirit as a Christian that there was something wrong about this book. So she decided to go to our fireplace and burn it. She put it in the fireplace. The only problem was it didn't burn. She had the fire going for a couple of hours and it wouldn't burn. She ended up chucking it out. And from that day forward, we never had any more problems in our house. Did we actively invite that into our house? No. The thing that I've learned about the way Satan works is he tries to claim ownership. He tries to claim ownership over things, over people and over places. And he tries to claim ownership, and it's usually people who give ownership. They might give ownership over an object like this book for some unknown reason. They may give ownership over a place by the way that they live or act in that place, or whether they, muck around with occultic practices. And the other thing as well is if you're from a family background or a cultural background where your ancestors have had a lot to do with spirits, the islands, probably Africa too, where your ancestors have been spirit worshippers. One of the things that I've learned, and I've learned with my wife and her family too, is that Satan believes he has ownership over you. Because your ancestors gave themselves to him in their worship of these spirits. And I found that when you come from that background, that oppression can be much harder to break than if you come from a background where your ancestors don't have that. I don't know if I'm talking nonsense. If you agree and you know from experience, you can come and talk to me afterwards. The point is, there's spiritual oppression. That's not possession. And Satan may try to oppress you, but it doesn't mean possession. So King Saul doesn't say that he was actually possessed. In fact, it says that when David played his harp, what happened to the spirit? The spirit departed. So he's not constantly exercising King Saul. It's the influence of David is making the spirit depart. He's not possessed, he's oppressed. So in the Old Testament, how many cases do we see where it directly talks about someone being possessed? You can correct me wrong if you can think of any others, but I can't think of any others in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we get many cases. I'm going to quickly go through the specific cases mentioned in relation to Jesus. In fact, if you look at Matthew 8, verse 16, how many cases do we see when Jesus was ministering? It says in Matthew 8:16, when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with a word and healed them who were ill. How many people are coming to him possessed? Many. Why, when Jesus comes along, do we get an explosion of cases? I wonder why. Maybe because Jesus is God in human flesh, and the battle between that man, he says, my name is Legion, or our name is Legion, when he talks to Jesus, because we are many. He casts them out to a herd of pigs, and the herd of pigs run over the edge of the cliff and drown themselves. There's the mute demoniac that Jesus heals after bringing Jairus' daughter back to life. There's a blind and mute demoniac in Matthew 12. There's a Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus and pleads with him to cast the spirit out of her daughter. And that's the case where Jesus says, I've come for the Jews. And she says, well, even the dogs under the table get the crumbs. That's another case which we see. We see Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, it mentions that Jesus actually cast several demons from her. There's also the demoniac that he meets in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4. One thing I find really interesting is in the book of John, the Gospel of John, how many times do we see Jesus healing demoniacs in the book of John? It doesn't actually mention any, which I find interesting. I don't know why, but you can ask John that one day when you get to heaven. Probably he thinks the subject has been covered enough already, I don't know. The other thing as well, elsewhere in the New Testament, we see mentions, general mentions to people being healed of demons in the New Testament, especially in the early days of the church. But we see a specific example where Paul, in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas start ministering in Philippi, and a girl who is demon-possessed starts following him around. He delays it for a few days, and then he finally casts the demon out of this girl and gets them in trouble with the local authorities, and they get thrown in jail. So we have these cases. One thing I want to make the point of is that in the Bible, demon possession is actually a very rare thing. And anecdotally as well. Anecdotally, demon possession is a very, very rare thing. I've never personally come across someone that I actually knew to be demon possessed and had an experience with that. I have a friend who did. She was a counsellor on summer camps, and there was a girl in her cabin who was 15. And for some reason she went into the cabin one night and the girl was there on her own, but there wasn't a girl voice that came out of this girl's mouth. It was very much a low, deep male voice, and she was very aggressive. And all of a sudden she found herself knowing that she was in the presence of someone who had possession. She asked how many people were there. The girl said there were 7 demons inside of her, and she didn't have time to go and get another leader or whatever else. And so she just prayed and talked to the girl and commanded these spirits. She'd never had any experience with this. Commanded the spirits to come out in the name of Jesus, and after a couple of hours she said that there was a distinct physical thing where it looked like the girl was vomiting every time one of these spirits came out. And after that happened, a new voice would be there. And that happened only a few years ago. This is a friend of mine, and she'd never had any experience with any of this before. That's the only personal experience I've heard. I think from what I understand in the Bible, and also from what I know anecdotally, demon possession is a very rare thing. Demonic oppression, probably not as rare, but demonic possession is. The other thing that we get an idea of from the Bible is that someone cannot be demonically possessed by accident. They've got to actually do something which invites the spirits to be able to come in. So you might think to yourself, I wonder, I don't know if you've ever thought to yourself, if you've ever thought, I'm really struggling, or I'm really struggling with my walk with God, or I wonder whether there's something going on. I don't know if you've ever questioned whether you're demonically possessed. I know at a time in my life, I kind of was curious and questioning it as well. The main thing is, if you're demonically possessed, you won't be questioning it, 100%. You can't hide it. It's not something that you would be questioning. You would know for certain. So the points I would make, possession is very rare biblically and anecdotally. Also, possession is distinctly different from oppression. Another point I want to make as well is that when we look at the idea of human evil, people who are evil and perform evil acts, just because someone is very evil, we think of someone in history like Hitler, doesn't mean they're demonically possessed. Doesn't mean they have any demonic relationship at all. If you turn to James chapter 1, very quickly in verses 13 and 14, we see an interesting perspective he gives us. Verses 13 to 14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by what?
His own lust.
His own lust. So what is he saying to us? He's saying, when you're tempted, don't blame God, but also who else can you not blame?
Yourself.
Satan. Stop blaming Satan for your temptation. Because guess what? When we became evil, Eve was tempted, wasn't she? Jesus was tempted. But both of those two people were perfect, weren't they? They had no sin. As soon as Satan got us over the line and we chose to be evil, just like he did, we all have free agency. Guess how much help we need from Satan to be evil and do bad things? None at all. We are capable of being just as evil as he is, all on our own. Just because someone's evil doesn't mean there's any possession behind it. Doesn't even mean that there's any involvement of Satan at all. He doesn't need to. Because what was Satan? He was perfect. He sinned. He's been able to come up with all this evil himself. We were perfect. We sinned. We're capable of coming up with plenty of our own evil, without his help. Don't blame God and don't blame Satan. It's not their fault. Whose fault is it? James says it's our fault. Just because we have evil in our lives doesn't mean we're possessed. The Bible doesn't say that that's what it equals. Evil does not equal possession. But the other thing as well is when we talk about mental health is a distinctly different thing from demon possession. There's a lot of mental health in our world. The Bible talks about mental health being a different thing. It is a very different thing. If someone is possessed by a demon, but they also have mental health, two separate things, okay? You have bad mental health and you are possessed by a demon. Do you think that someone possessed by a demon, the demon in them would make their mental health worse or better? Probably worse. It will have an impact on your mental health, but the point is that it doesn't cause your mental health, your issues with mental health. It would be there all on its own. They can coexist and impact each other, but they're separate things. What is the whole point to this? What do we see from the Bible? We see that possession is very rare. We see that spiritual possession and oppression are different things. We see that mental health, mental illness is a different thing from demonic possession. When we talk about mental health, I'll just make this little announcement. One of the biggest problems we have in the world today is we don't deal with mental health very well, or mental health very well. Mental health is when there is something physically wrong with what? Our brain. And it is physically wrong. It's got to do with the chemistry balance in your brain. Someone who has dementia, it's a physical impediment on their brain. Their brain health is low. There's something going on. Their brain wastes away. People with dementia, their brain can actually draw down and get a lot, sort of shrink away. Is the brain a physical part of our body? So there is no difference between heart disease and mental health or mental illness. Because all it is it's a part of our body that's not working right, isn't it? I can have heart disease. Do I say that's a demon? No. Why do we say when I have mental illness that we try to make it related to spiritual life, our spiritual life at all? Now, if you have a really strong relationship with God and you also have a mental illness, you have some sort of mental illness, do you think that having a strong relationship with God would help your mental illness? Yep, it would. Just like if I have heart disease and I have a strong faith with God, is it going to help my heart disease, me coping with it? It'll help me coping with it. Will it make my heart disease or my mental illness go away? No, because it's a physical impairment. We've got to really get to the point where we understand mental health is real. It's got nothing to do with the spiritual world. It's a physical illness, just like any other illness we may have. When we look at the Bible treats the two things as separate. If we're dealing with someone who is struggling and you don't know whether it's mental health or possession, Okay? You may not know. Number one, you need to assume that possession is very rare. It's most likely not possession. The second thing, if you're dealing with someone you know who is struggling and obviously has some sort of issue with mental health, deal with the spiritual side of things and the mental health side of things completely separately. Do not mix the two together, please. Never ever say to someone struggling from mental health issues, your faith will make you well. All you need to do is trust in God more. Why? Why is that not a good thing to do? Well, if someone's struggling with mental health, they may be depressed, they may have other issues that they're going through. To say that their faith will make them well, what if their faith doesn't? If I had a bad ankle, Tomo, can you say to me, have faith that your bad ankle will become better. And if your ankle doesn't become better, it's an indication your faith isn't strong enough in God. How is he going to start feeling when his ankle's still bad? Does God just heal every physical infirmity we have? Are there any examples in the Bible where God doesn't heal physical infirmities? Paul, he prays 3 times for this thorn in his flesh to go away. And what does God say? My grace is sufficient for you. Does God heal everything that's wrong with us? No. Is God going to heal someone's mental illness? Not always. Sometimes he's going to say to them, my grace is sufficient for you. Isn't he? One of the most damaging things we can do if someone is struggling with poor mental health is to say, if you have enough faith, God will heal you, or you just need to trust God more. That'll probably make them feel worse, won't it? It'll make them feel worse. And it's not the root cause of their problem. So how do we deal with possession? Well, I say this to you, and this is my finishing remark. I hope you never have to deal with possession ever. I've never had to deal with a genuine case of demonic possession. I hope you never have to either. If you ever come across one, never deal with it on your own if you can help it. Get help from other people. Get help from spiritual elders. Get help from spiritual leaders in your church. Don't deal with it on your own if you can. If you are dealing with someone, and it will be very apparent to you if you are. You can't mistake it. It's not something you can kind of go, is it possession or not? You'll know 100% if it is or it isn't. You won't need to question it. But if you are, remember this. We don't overcome Satan through anything we do. Jesus has already overcome Satan on the cross. And we just claim that and we rely on that. We claim things like that Jesus is the Son of the living God, that he is the first and the last, that he defeated Satan by dying on the cross and being raised the 3rd day. We are covered by his blood, and those who are in Christ have no condemnation. We claim that Satan is a defeated foe who was thrown out of heaven and has no authority to accuse us anymore. They're the things that we claim. Claim Scripture. So as we finish up today, what would I say to you? If you struggle with this area yourself, I want to encourage you. If you struggle with what you think might be poor mental health, and sometimes that may be circumstantial, remember what God said to Paul. God's grace is sufficient for you. He may not take away all of our infirmities, but he will give us the strength to cope with whatever infirmities we may have. Rely on God. It won't take things away, but God's grace is sufficient for us. It's not an indication of your spiritual health. If you struggle with anything in your life, it's not an indication that you are not connected to God. It's just an indication we live in a sinful world, and that sinful world has had an impact on us. And we're waiting for the day when God will heal all things, won't he? When he comes back a second time, that's when all this stuff will go away. That's when we will have freedom from mental health, from physical infirmities. Let's claim that. And let's claim that as we sing our final hymn, 171. God is the glory.